Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. All right, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, Shane Lemaster, and we are here for episode number 88 with very special guest, Adam Bramlage. How are you, sir?
Doing well, Shane. Doing well. It's great to be here and have this conversation with you tonight.
Yeah, nice. So for those of you who are just listening to the podcast, Adam's got a sweet background on his Zoom call of some mushrooms. They look a little purple to me. But yeah, they look yummy.
This is a psychedelic variety out of Jamaica that hasn't been found there, I think, since 1918. So one of my mycologist friends sent me this photo a while back, and I just love the clarity and how beautiful these mushrooms are.
It is. It looks really vibrant. I love photography. My brother's a professional photographer, and I wish I would have stuck with it a little bit more, just because a picture really is worth 1,000 words if you can capture it right. Most of mine are blurry.
Yeah, photography isn't always easy, and especially photographing mushrooms. You know, the guys that are doing it well are using flashes and all kinds of time delays, and trying to light up the mushroom on every side of it. So it's come a long way, and they're getting some really beautiful pictures these days.
Yeah, and how cool would it be if technology gets good enough one of these days where we can actually take snapshots of our inner world, right? Our inner consciousness or our mind, or the pictures of our dreams or things like that, or take video. I've heard Elon Musk on a couple podcasts talk about how that might be a potential in our lifetime. That would be pretty sweet too.
I definitely believe there's a lot of things we haven't even begun to touch, and working with these mushrooms and these plant medicines, you really begin to see the infinite possibilities. And I have these mushrooms as a background more than anything because they saved my life, and they're helping a lot of people that I work with. And what's really cool is we're doing this in micro doses. We're talking about sub-perceptual doses of mushrooms, and I really feel like they are the future of medicine, especially in psychiatry and dealing with depression and anxiety.
Nice. Yeah, I hope to get into that here in just a few seconds, but I have to ask you the first question that I always ask all my guests, and it's the only standardized question that I have. And that is, the podcast name is Conversations with the Mind. And I'm wondering, just for you, when you hear that phrase, Conversations with the Mind, how does that land with you? What sort of imagery comes up? And what does that phrase possibly mean for you in your own life, Conversations with the Mind?
Yeah, for me, I've dealt with a lot of depression in my life. And so a lot of times when you're dealing with trauma and depression, your mind isn't always your greatest friend. And your mind can work against you. So for me, conversations with your mind, a big part of my progress and my work with mushrooms was really learning that I needed to reprogram my mind, and I needed to take a lot of these old thought patterns that thought negatively and had bad self-image, stuff like that, and I needed to really rewire and rework them. So for me, conversations with my mind is first, I was having a lot of negative conversations with my mind. And then I had to learn certain techniques, exercise, meditation, yoga, things like that, that really allowed me to begin to quiet my mind and, get away from that monkey mind that they talk about in Eastern society, really learn to calm my mind and begin to have really positive and beautiful conversations with my mind. So my own mind has been a journey. It didn't start in a great place. It's in a much better place now. And I am having much more beautiful conversations with my mind. So for me, that's what comes up to me is for people in their happiness, they really need to have control or an understanding of their mind. And a lot of times people's minds are working against them. So for me, that's kind of what comes up.
I love that. And it's so true. We have this like unlimited access subjectively to this own, we all do, to this conversation within our mind. And a lot of us, especially these days during 2020, our mind is distorted or is pumped full of like fear messaging or all sorts of things that can cause us to just feel really bad. was hoping you could, and this is the first time that I'm actually getting to talk to you for all the listeners out there. We were acquainted through a mutual friend of ours. He's listening to the podcast. So what's up, Charlie? Um, anyway, I was hoping you could, enlighten me a little bit. Tell me a little bit about your story. I too suffered with a lot of depression. I'm sure we have a lot in common on that front. But can you tell me and the listeners sort of what it was like for you in your own mind and your consciousness coming up through, your earlier years, and what worked, what didn't work, and how you found yourself to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a society, a very wealthy, white, um, alcoholic-based society. Everything was based around alcohol, celebrations, success, all of that. So alcohol was introduced to me at an early age, seventh, eighth, ninth grade. Lucky for me, I was very small. I was like 90 pounds and 5 feet tall, so half a beer would get me shit-faced. So right away, alcohol didn't work for me. And I was dealing with depression from being small, from not fitting in. I was a musician and I found cannabis. And right away in high school, I began to use cannabis to kind of treat my depression and make me feel better. Um, and it actually helped me quite a bit. And so later on in life after college, I actually moved to California and I began to get into the cannabis space in the hopes of it going legal one day, because I believe so strongly in this medicine as the ability to help people specifically with depression. Um, Cannabis can also be really sticky and really seductive too, and it can also be a crutch for people. And I was one of those people, and more than anything, it really was helping like a band-aid over a wound. But it wasn't really helping me dive into that wound. And so about 2 years ago, I went through some major trauma in my life, major shakeup with my legal cannabis business, kind of had the rug pulled out from under me and was super depressed. And I began to read reports about the studies at John Hopkins and about that they were finding that psilocybin was literally blocking the default mode network of the brain that dealt with depression. And I decided to start to self-treat myself with a mushroom honey that I'd gotten from a friend. What I found was within the first dose and within those first few days that I literally could shut down the depression in my brain by taking the right amount of psilocybin. And for once, conversations with our mind, my mind was beginning to work with me with the help of psilocybin instead of against me. Prior to psilocybin, that conversation in my mind was, you're a piece of shit. You couldn't hold your marriage together. You couldn't hold your job together. Couldn't do this. You couldn't do that. It was a lot of negative voices. And literally, the psilocybin became a disruptor. And it became a device or a way for me to fall deeply in love with myself and really begin to accept myself and work through a lot of my traumas and a lot of my stuff. And I was having profound things happen within the first week of using this medicine. So I dove deeply into the research on microdosing and looked into that, and began to come up with my own recipe and figure out how to microdose safely and effectively. And it changed my life. I mean, I was depressed for 39 years and truly thought that there was no hope, that I would never feel better. I used to sometimes have to take bong rips to get out of bed just to get through my day. And all of a sudden, with the help of psilocybin, my life was changing. I was eating better. I was exercising. I was thinking better. The conversations in my mind were positive. They were uplifting. They were beautiful. They were hopeful. And that was a direct correlation to the mushrooms and to the psilocybin and to the fungal intelligence that these mushrooms carry. And I was doing a combination of large dose journeys where I would do a large dose hero journey about once a month, self guided, safe set and setting in my own home with an eye mask and a playlist. And I would use these large dose journeys to kind of ask the mushrooms for guidance, kind of in the same way that Terrence McKenna, would also get downloads. And sure enough, they began to kind of say, hey, people are going to start coming to you. They're going to want to know about microdosing. They're going to want to know how to do it safely and effectively. They're going to want to know about exercise and diet. They're literally going to knock on your door and they're going to say, what are you doing differently that's made you change like this? And so that's basically what happened. Is I didn't seek out anybody, I didn't advertise, but I would just post videos on Facebook or share something with people, and they would see such a drastic change in someone they grew up with, seen as kind of happy-go-lucky, but also an Eeyore of sorts, also depressed and gray a lot of the time. So before I knew it, friends and family came to me and they said, what are you doing differently? And we began to work with other individuals and incorporate microdosing in their life. And um, it's been absolutely life-changing. Right now, I have more than 60 clients that are using microdosing to optimize their life and get off everything from antidepressants to Percocet to alcohol, you name it. It's just been absolutely the most amazing journey. I never could have written it. Hollywood couldn't have come up with a more amazing story. It's been an absolute perfect miracle. But I needed to work with cannabis for a decade to see the differences between psilocybin and cannabis, and to see how psilocybin actually allowed me to dive into the wound and heal the wound instead of just being a band-aid. And so that's why right now I've dedicated my life to educating and coaching and kind of teaching people the real truth behind psychedelics, specifically the use of microdosing.
Nice. I love it. You and I are on a very similar path, and from you telling me a little bit about your history and your background, we came from what sounds like similar roots. My entire family for many, many generations, alcohol has been a huge part of it. Addiction in general. It runs in my blood. It runs in my genes. And for me, I knew that growing up, in my teenage years, and it was something that I wanted to avoid. So I stayed away from everything. I stayed away from alcohol, tobacco, all drugs. I was like, holding up the cross to it, like, no, even though I was an atheist at the time, that sort of metaphor was still there. And it wasn't until high school and military school when I was exposed to my first ever drug experience with LSD. And from that point on, my entire concept of the world and what was possible was blown open, and has stayed open since then. So you said you were depressed for 39 years. So this was like something you were dealing with throughout your childhood too, even before the alcohol. Did the alcohol make it worse? I know for me, the alcohol piece of my story was the most damaging piece. And it wasn't until, I had my first ever spiritual white light experience, actually sober in a jail cell in my teenage years, my late teens, that I was told by some other force outside of myself, or maybe inside of myself too, that alcohol was the problem, and that if I just simply remove that from the equation, then everything will get better. And I did, and things like the depression and the suicidal thoughts started clearing up, and things like that. For you, was what role did the alcohol play in your story? You said that you grew up around it. It didn't take you much to get drunk, but it sounds like it had some negative effect for you.
Yeah, I just saw the way that it worked in my community, and I saw what happened to respectable adults when they got shit-faced. And I saw the way that they acted, and I saw the way that they spoke, and I saw that the damage that alcohol caused in a lot of relationships. Um, so I just personally saw firsthand that everybody was using alcohol and it seemed to be okay, but it had a lot of detrimental aspects to it. Lucky for me, it never worked for me. I was always the kid that was like the designated driver and smoking weed. So alcohol never worked with me, but I saw it damage a lot of my friends. And I saw it, just put them in states that if I could have shot a video with them on a smartphone 20 years ago, they'd be super embarrassed at the way they were acting. So for me, alcohol, I'm totally okay with speaking out about how bad I truly think alcohol is. Um, I feel like it distills the spirit of the person. Hence, why it's called spirits from hundreds or thousands of years ago. And personally, for me, I have a story that ties me to microdosing. Where a few years ago, I found my friend's body after he took his life with a handgun, and he had an alcohol problem, and he had had it for most of his life. It started back in high school in this community we went to. He then went on to college where he was a frat boy, and where you were rewarded for slamming 30 cans of Bud Light, and alcohol was just made normal to this person. And he was a really beautiful man and he was really amazing, but He never could get over the addiction. And at that time, ketamine wasn't available. He couldn't go to a clinic and use ketamine. We didn't know what we know now about psilocybin and its ability to help. And so, I do a lot of this work for my buddy Max as well, and for a lot of these people that have these heavy addictions to something like alcohol or heroin, and they don't have a lot of hope. So for me, unfortunately, I've just seen alcohol lower people's judgment. I've seen it lead to physical fights between men, between women. And I just don't think that it's something that leads to the betterment of society. As somebody that was in the cannabis space legally, I found it really shocking that I had to pay extra money to put cannabis proof packaging on all my products when my child could go into my fridge and crack a couple beers and drink himself to death, or open a fifth of vodka and slam it. So, alcohol and tobacco, they get a free pass because of how much money they make for certain people and the powers that be. But the future of medicine are these natural plant medicines like mushrooms, ayahuasca, ibogaine, mescaline, peyote, all this good stuff that the creator created, and that wasn't made in the lab. And so, alcohol, um, I've seen microdosing specifically with psilocybin be a disruptor for addiction to alcohol. And I've seen it have really great effects with people being able to give up the alcohol cold turkey. So, um, case in point, I'm not a big advocate for alcohol. I don't like it. I'm not a big drinker, and I just think it's tearing families apart more than it's bringing them together.
Yeah, absolutely. And you speak a lot about, and I'm totally hip to this too, about re-educating people on these plant medicines. But we also need to, part of that process, I think, is breaking down a lot of the education that we've received about other substances, right? The normalization of alcohol and tobacco, and really, a lot of the research showing us how bad and toxic it is for your body, just being swept under the rug for profits. I'm an addiction counselor myself, and we learn very, very soon, or very early on in our training, that how different drugs affect the body, and they show you, with these really interesting graphics of the human body and what each drug and which systems each drug affects. And alcohol affects literally every single cell in your body as a toxin, as a poison, as does tobacco. Well, modern forms of tobacco anyway. But people, they may hear that or whatever, but we just have this messaging that has been given to us since we were young, that these things are okay, they're acceptable. And so part, I think, of this re-education, this new movement that we're trying to put forth with educating people about these new medicines, is breaking down and deconditioning some of the previous education that had been put in people's minds, for sure. Now, you said your cannabis for you was sort of, it was blocking you from being able to really address your depression. And that's I hear that very commonly, and I think that it has had that similar effect on me at different parts of my life. For me, cannabis has been very helpful in a lot of different ways with anxiety and athletics and things like that. It's integrated quite heavily into the jiu-jitsu community. I even competed in a tournament a couple of years ago called the High Rollers, where you smoke a joint on the mat with your opponent right before you try and choke each other to death.
Right.
It's freaking awesome. But do you still use cannabis in any way? I know you got out of the business, in favor of this microdosing venture, but do you still use cannabis, or do you still see the benefits of cannabis in your circles?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I still use cannabis daily. I use less cannabis than I used to now that I'm microdosing. But cannabis is a huge ally for myself. I want to be really clear that cannabis is a really special, powerful plant medicine. It helps a lot of people with pain, it helps a lot of people with depression, and it is a very powerful, beneficial medicine. With that said, in my own personal life, at times it also became a crutch where instead of maybe feeling my feelings or processing the trauma, I would smoke weed and numb out a little bit. So for me, it was just something where it would kind of take the edge off. and it would be beneficial. It would help me get through my day, but it wasn't necessarily, like I said, helping me dive deeper. And then, when I started working with the psilocybin, that was a big life changer for me because it changed every aspect of my life. I began to exercise. Now, don't get me wrong, I still play competitive soccer twice a week, very high level, and I always use cannabis before I play. And I use cannabis because it's a bronchial dilator, meaning it expands our lungs, allows us to take in more O2. And then also it helps to put me in a flow state where I'm not thinking about anything but being in the moment on the field. So I believe very, very strongly in cannabis. I use it in conjunction with the microdosing. I think that they work really well together. And I do think there is a next level intelligence to the mushrooms. And if you look at, fossil records and what we know about scientific data, plants and animals split from mushrooms 350 million years ago. Okay, so plants were mushrooms, animal were mushrooms. We all came from mushrooms. So, mushrooms are somewhat the ancient teachers. They're the original intelligence. And they just had this compassion to them. They had this empathy to them, similar to that of cannabis. I very much felt the very feminine, loving energy of cannabis. And again, I've heard curanderos or shamans talk about how cannabis can also be very sticky and seductive and can really suck people in. And the guys that have to take, 6 bong rips of the strongest concentrate you can find just to get high because their tolerance is built up. And that might be a point where you might want to step back. But no, I feel strongly that cannabis is a very positive, very helpful medicine. I do think it works really well with psilocybin. If you listen to Dennis McKenna talk about how he would do his 5-gram journeys, he would roll 3 joints of cannabis. He would smoke 1 joint 45 minutes after eating the mushrooms. He'd smoke another joint in the middle of the session, and then he'd smoke a 3rd joint at the end to close the circle. So I believe there's a space for cannabis and psilocybin to work together. I think they work together really well. And there was this next level of intelligence and motivation with these mushrooms, where I just seemed to have more energy. And I think that had to do with the way the mushrooms work with the brain and the way that I was stacking lion's mane mushroom with the psilocybin, which is a mushroom that we know creates neurogenesis and increases neuroplasticity. So these mushrooms are literal brain food, and they literally have helped me rewire my brain so that my conversations with my mind are kind and uplifting and hopeful.
Nice. And I definitely want to get to the flow stuff because that's sort of my jam, having a master's degree in sports psychology. But I wanted to just say for the audience out there that there are folks out there, practitioners, licensed clinicians out there who are exploring intentional ways to use cannabis, different ways than what we think of when we usually think of cannabis being used as a crutch or a way to relax at the end of the night or something like that. But there are very intentional ways, much like the intentional use of a lot of these other plant medicines where you set an intention beforehand. There's possibly psychotherapy that goes into it before the session. You can smoke cannabis and have a closed-eyed session with music and do a lot of that deep healing trauma work that you can with other medicines too. And it can also, in this way, I mean, it's commonly referred to as a gateway drug, although I think alcohol is the real gateway to most other negative drugs. But in a way, cannabis can be a gateway or an easy way to dip your toe into this sort of intentional inner work, right? Because you're not going to be blasted off to some other dimension. Well, you can on really high doses of cannabis, but it's very easy to control your dosage, very easy to go just under the surface if you're a little hesitant to explore those depths, because they can be scary. I mean, if you're going to be healing trauma, you got to face that trauma first, and you got to see it for what it is, and that can be really scary for people. So I just want to let the listeners know too that cannabis can be used really intentionally too, with ceremony, like you mentioned with Dennis McKenna, who I had on my podcast before too. He's an amazing guy. And I wanted to comment a little bit. You said you were talking about how humans split off from mushrooms, humans and animals split off from mushrooms. And that's such an interesting story. When I looked into that myself, in the archaeological record that's published and things like that. And I also followed, I did a little self-study in how humans migrated across land masses, and then sort of transposed or did a couple other self-studies on how cannabis and how psychoactive mushrooms sort of traveled across different land masses. And it was fascinating to see that wherever humans went, these plants and these fungi went with them. It was almost like we were intimately connected on this cosmic level, even before language, even before any of that stuff that we think of as more modern. These plants were with us and we were utilizing them, or they were somehow, like you said, like great wisdom teachers following us along our path to help guide us towards like higher and higher states of consciousness, higher and higher states of evolution, really teaching us along the way. So I just found that interesting that you brought that up, because that's one of the most interesting aspects of human history in relation to these plant medicines that I've come across.
Yeah, and when they look at humans, plants, and mushrooms, we're more closely related to mushrooms than we are to plants. Um,
Yeah, genetically,
so
right?
yeah, so it would make sense that these mushrooms would be a medicine for our body, and they would be able to, they're adaptogenic, so they have the ability to find the deficiencies in each unique individual and help their body adapt to what they need. And that's really the power and the specialty of these mushrooms. But yeah, they've been around way longer than we have. Um, and a lot of people don't even know that LSD in and of itself was synthesized from ergot, which is a fungus, and a form of mushroom. So we learn more and more about mushrooms every day. Paul Stamets, who's an amazing teacher into mushroom, he tells the story that mushrooms have followed human civilization since the beginning of time. And where do psychedelic mushrooms pop up? They pop up after catastrophe and in wood debris. When people are chopping trees to build homes or towns or communities, mushrooms are going to be growing around the base of all the trees that are cut down. They're going to be growing in the wood chips around the houses. So more than anything, I believe, and I think this is part of Michael Pollan's kind of theory in botany of desire, is that, cannabis and apples and mushrooms, these plants, they use humans to spread their spores, around the country or the world, and to get their work done. And we have no clue that we're even doing it. Which, brings me back to the whole idea of the stoned ape theory, and the idea that, Terence McKenna put out, that these hominids or Homo sapiens, as they came out of the jungle canopy, began to track large game. And what do you do when you track large game? You look for animal scat. What grows in animal scat all across the African Sahara? These psychedelic mushrooms. What happens when you eat these mushrooms? Your mind grows, neurogenesis happens, synesthesia, the ability to see sounds or hear words. I mean, just crazy, amazing stuff happens with the brain. So, I really strongly believe that these mushrooms have helped us develop and evolve into these amazing humans that we are today. And that, you know, the biggest travesty that happened is, 500 years ago or so, when the Christian church realized how powerful these mushrooms were in Mesoamerica, and they outlawed them, and they created mycophobia around the world. And 1526, I believe, they banned the ability to put psychedelic mushrooms in beer. But prior to 1526, they used to spike beer and mead with psychedelic mushrooms and have pagan dancing parties in the woods for days and weeks. So these mushrooms were a huge, huge problem to the church. And if you could eat a plant or a fungus that connected you to God, you didn't need the priest, you didn't need the church, you didn't need the altar, you didn't need the blood of Christ, you didn't need the sin, you didn't need all the nonsense. So more than anything, thanks to technology, the internet, cell phones, you can't hide the truth anymore. And people are waking up. And, the more we use these medicines, the more connected we are to the earth, the more empathetic and connected we are to the people we love, and the better humans we become.
Yeah, Dennis McKenna loves to say that we're not cultivating the plants are cultivating us, right? Like you said,
Exactly.
like we're the ones spreading the pollen, spreading the spores. Um, that's I think that's a lot more accurate than we think. And like you said, like these mushrooms and these fungi and these other medicines, cannabis too, and soma and all these other things, like they are the things that brought about spiritual traditions, brought about religions and things like that, and then were outlawed, like you said, because these could literally be considered like the sacrament, right? Like the body of God, right? You take that in order to become closer to God. Well, that's exactly what the mushrooms do, and other plant medicines as well. I think it's so fascinating how all that history has been covered up and covered up intentionally, for reasons of power and control. And the powers that be don't want a bunch of humans going around thinking for themselves, because then they're going to start challenging those power structures. And I know for me, that first LSD experience, I was all about, I wanted to be a Navy SEAL. I wanted to be in the military, which is all about power and control. And then one dose of LSD, and I went back to my military school, and I'm like, fuck this. Like, I do not want to have, like, you guys don't have any right to tell me what I can and cannot do. No religious leader has the right to tell me what I can and cannot believe. I saw God. Like, I don't need you to describe him to me in this book. And by the way, he looks nothing like you're describing. So I just think it's a travesty how all this stuff was covered up. And we're
But that
blind to it.
but that's but that's the exact reason that the military or the government or the Christian Roman Church back in the day didn't want you to have these substances, is because it connected you immediately to source.
Mhm.
And so they replaced the sacred sacrament, which was cannabis or mushrooms or these plants that God gave us, and they replaced it with alcohol. That's a fucking depressant. Think about that. They're feeding us this blood of Christ that they know is depressing us and causing drama and causing fights. You know, it's totally on purpose. It makes total sense, and it's not surprising to me. It always reminds me of the scene in Pineapple Express where they're in like the military testing camp and the soldier smokes a joint, and then they try to give him orders, and he's basically like, "Fuck you! I don't have to do anything." And that's part of why these plant medicines have been taken away, is because they would make everything you've told be false. They would make all the power structures that have always held power over you crumble immediately. And that's what you can get from one large dose journey of LSD or one large dose journey of ayahuasca or mushrooms, is you get this knowledge that you're so much more powerful and we are so much more powerful as beings than they've led us to believe.
Mhm.
And the Romans, who, far as I know, were around the time created Christianity, they were already putting fluoride in their water system. They already knew that fluoride made you lethargic and lazy and not think for yourself. So the Romans, they knew what they were doing. So, with that said, you talked about how a lot of people blame cannabis for being the gateway drug. The best quote I've ever heard about this is by Russell Brand, and he says actually trauma is the gateway drug. And trauma is usually what leads people to alcohol or tobacco or cannabis, and then on to harder and harder drugs. The long and short of it was, when I was a kid, the easiest thing to get was cigarettes and alcohol. It was hard to get cannabis, but you could always go in your parents' liquor cabinet or steal dad's pack of smokes or something like that. So I agree with you that it's way easier for kids to get started on alcohol and tobacco than something like cannabis. And then that brings me to this new book called The Immortality Key. I don't know if you've heard about it, but he was just on Joe Rogan, and they've actually used scientific data and I'm not sure how they carbon date the stuff, but they've tested the oldest Christian altar they found, and it was on the altar. They found cannabis and they found frankincense. And on more than one occasion, they found cannabis residue in the scepter, or it's not the scepter, whatever the thing is that the priest swings. Usually it's with incense in our day. That used to be cannabis. They used to literally be clam boxing the whole church with cannabis, and they were using cannabis as a sacrament. And They burned all of that history. They got rid of it. And the only way we've proven it is by researchers going out there and finding these artifacts and doing the new carbon data and proving everybody wrong.
Yeah. And, we've talked quite a bit about, the origins of modern human and their relation to these plant medicines. So I have an off the wall sort of question for you. I want to go back even further and talk about the origins of the mushroom themselves. And there's a number of theories that I've heard floating around about, how mushrooms came to be on this planet. And I'm just curious, like, what are the theories that spark your interest the most as far as how mushrooms got here?
You know what? I've only one time eaten a penis envy mushroom, and I ate a very small amount of it, which was told to me was a microdose. And these are very potent mushrooms. And I saw from that little bit of mushrooms truly the sheer power and force of this fungus. So for me to say that I could really explain to you fully where it comes would be a complete guess. But if I were to guess, a lot of the stuff I've heard is that these spores are floating out in space. And basically, these mushrooms are different intelligence from another planet. And I'm not sure if you've seen Fantastic Fungi yet, but if you haven't, it's an amazing movie that talks a lot about that and has visuals to when the Earth began, that it was large, giant mushrooms towering over everything and not trees. And that actually plants and animals and everything, like I said earlier, was created from these mushrooms. So for me, as somebody who has effectively used mushrooms to turn myself into a happy individual and then continues to use mushrooms to help other people improve their life, I just have to say, they're the beginning, they're the middle, they're the end. Um, I can't explain to you where they come from, but the biggest theory I've heard is that they're extraterrestrial, that they're from a different galaxy, and that's maybe how they got here. I have no clue.
Yeah, that's my favorite theory too, that they are interstellar travelers that have come to us, via asteroid or whatever. I met this gentleman at the Detroit Psychedelic Conference a few years ago, who recently passed away, Kalindi Iyi, who's famous for taking 40 plus gram doses of psilocybin. And when I talked to him about the origins, he said that very same thing. He said he's been blasted off to those other galaxies and seen the origins and spoken with, the master mushrooms on these different planets and other dimensions. And I believe him. I've never taken 40 grams myself, but I mean, what is that? That's 8 times the heroic dose. And he's more of a hero. He's sort of an unsung hero in this community because, a lot of people don't know about him when compared to, more mainstream folks like Paul Stamets and folks like that. But I think, if the listeners are interested in really getting deep down this rabbit hole, they should go look up some of Kalindi's videos on YouTube and check out some of the things he's said, because he has been to places that maybe no other human being has ever been.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought him up because I wasn't familiar with Kalindi until after he passed. And when I drove down the wormhole or dove down the wormhole of his life's work, it's amazing. I mean, everybody looks at Terrence McKenna, who's passed away now, as the person who took the largest dose of mushrooms and went to these other planets and figured out the stoned ape theory and did all of these things for us. But very few people have heard of Kalindi, who was talking about taking 35, 40 grams of mushrooms. And I believe he's the one for me that really connected all of the ancient technology and wisdom that the Egyptians and the Aztecs and the Mayans, all of the downloads I believe they got were probably coming in that 30 to 40 gram dose. And the little bit of research on Kalindi I did, he would very, very often say, you have to take these massive, massive doses to connect with these ancient spirits and these ancient technologies. But yeah, very, very, very beautiful man who died way too young. And I only hope that, much like with a Van Gogh or an artist, that he only becomes more popular posthumous, and we have more of a dialogue about that. For most people, 95% of people probably don't want to do a 40 gram journey. You know what I mean? It's not set up for the backyard weekend warrior, but for someone like Kalindi and for some of these people who've been brought here on the planet to take those journeys and come back and tell someone like myself what's down there. I mean, that's absolutely amazing. And for me, I've always felt like the Egyptians and the people down, the Aztecs, the Mayans, their different level of technology, their connection and communication with the aliens was through large dose of mushrooms. And if you talk to Kalindi, you eat 40 grams of mushrooms, and there are aliens there telling you how to build a pyramid and showing you how to levitate rocks and showing you how to use your mind to go to other planets and other dimensions. And in my mind, that really is what time travel is. You take a lot of this, enough of this plant medicine, and you literally can time travel. I know for me on ayahuasca, I have time traveled and gone back in time and been in my past with my spirit, much like Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol and Ebenezer Scrooge watching his younger life unfold. Like I have time traveled with the help of plant medicines. And sometimes with really deep trauma, you got to do that time traveling. And that's why these plants are ancient technologies, and I believe the medicine of the future. And it's really going to lend to helping and healing our planet, because not only can we eat these mushrooms, but we can use things like oyster mushrooms to remediate oil spills, and to, mushrooms eat up plastics and houses and all kinds of stuff. Right now, Paul Stamets is using the mushrooms to save the bees. So I think more than anything, in the next decade, we're going to get closer and closer to mushrooms and all these plant medicines.
Yeah, I've time traveled too, like you're saying, and that's been some of the deepest inner child work that I've done before. I can still recall pretty vividly one of the most traumatic events of my childhood. I think I was 4 or 5 years old. My mom was celebrating for my aunt's wedding. We were at a hotel. My little brother and I were left with a babysitter, and she fell asleep in the hotel room. And being curious little Shane, I opened the hotel room door and found myself in this hallway that just seemed infinite, and locked myself out of the room and was banging on the door. It must have been 3 or 4 in the morning, and no one could hear me. Very traumatic, screaming and cowering in a corner, just thinking, I was in this infinite hallway and nobody's coming to save me. And in one of my bigger psychedelic journeys, I literally transported my adult self back into that hallway and saw little Shane there. And I was able to provide comfort and nurturing and hold him and let him know everything's going to be okay. And it was amazing. Like I learned in that moment that I could literally time travel back through my narrative and heal myself and heal my own trauma and provide myself with the love and the nurturing and the attention that I never got back then. And from that instance during that psychedelic journey of self-healing, I came out of that and I had it like, it's like I had totally rewritten or restitched my narrative together from back then. Just amazing. And you're right. There's probably, 90, probably even 99% of people don't want to take a 40-gram dose, but we need that 1%. We need that small 10% who are willing to volunteer for that kind of courageous journey to do that. I certainly have that on my bucket list, when I maybe have a few weeks that I don't have anything planned, because it's going to take some serious integration to come back from that. But yeah, we need that. We need to be able to connect on those deep levels and talk to those whatever they are, entities, hyperdimensional beings, whatever that are around us at all times that we're just not perceiving. You did mention.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I know you work a lot with addiction, which in the work I've done usually comes from trauma. And, just the idea that a lot of times, especially when you've had early childhood trauma, your default mode network is more active. And more than anything, it's trying to protect you. So a lot of the times, you forget about childhood trauma. Sometimes people forget about sexual abuse. They've buried out of their mind because their mind's trying to protect them, or they forget about something that happened in their childhood that was so painful. And these psychedelics are these special tools that cut through the fucking noise. Like literally, you could sit in 30 years of talk therapy and never get back to that one moment in the hallway. And you take one dose of psychedelics and boom, you're there. And so for me, specifically mushrooms, but also ayahuasca, one time ayahuasca took me back to elementary school, and it showed me how mean I was to one kid. And it showed me how I picked on this one kid all through elementary school. And it showed me how painful it was from his side. And it taught me all so it's not always just about the pain that we have on us. It also can show you the pain that you've caused other people, and so there are these great teachers that unlock these parts of our mind that sometimes we've locked away to protect ourselves because we don't know how to handle it, or we don't know what to do. But what these plant medicines do is they hold your hand, they take you back to that moment, and they help you help that wounded child so that you don't have to keep living that trauma over and over again. Because for people, if a child's been abused as a child and he's an adult, if he's 39 and he thinks about being molested as a child, his unconscious body still feels those feelings thinking about it. He hasn't done everything. Every time he thinks about it, he's brought back to that moment. What these psychedelics allow us to do is go back to that moment, bow to it, thank it, and then move on from it and heal from it. And sometimes that traumatized child is left back there. And I've had to go back there like you as adult Adam and hold that child and hug him and let him know that it's different now. And I think that really is the power of these psychedelics. Is there is not a Western medicine that you can develop in a lab other than maybe ketamine or LSD, which has basic psychedelic principles to them, that will give you this access to these parts of yourselves that you need for true healing. And that's why they lend to true healing, is they're like a microscope. You look in the microscope, it shines the focus on exactly the traumas or the things you need to work with. And then when you're sober and you're off the psychedelic, you go back to your life and you make the changes that need to be made to heal from those experiences. But without psychedelics, specifically mushrooms, ayahuasca, peyote, I would not be the person I am today. It has gained access to my traumas. It has allowed me to go back into time and literally rewrite my pain, so that I can be a positive and happy person in the present moment.
And what an amazing story you brought up, and a whole different side of this healing potential, right? Not just healing ourselves, but going back and seeing the wrongs that we've done to others. I don't hear that spoken about too often in the literature or even at psychedelic conferences, but I'm just imagine, and I've had those same experiences, being projected back and seeing, something that I said just, out of nowhere. It didn't mean much to me, but the effect that it had on someone else, and even being allowed to see like maybe how that could have played out in and through their adult life and affected, who they became. I'm wondering, with that experience where when you were projected back, and saw how mean you were to that kid, coming out of that, did you try and like reconnect with that person or find them on Facebook and apologize? I can just imagine, like, if all of us had that experience of all the harm we've done in this world, and then we came back from it and tried to make amends and rectify all the damage we've done, I mean, we'd all be getting like 10 phone calls a day with people apologizing to us for things that affected us very deeply. And how amazing would that feel if, Adam, if you got like a phone call every day of your adult life just from someone of your past saying like, hey, I'm so sorry I did this to you. Like, it hurt me to think about it. Like, were you able to reconnect with that person?
Yeah, actually, I shed a lot of tears in the session getting to feel what he felt like. And I have no doubt I destroyed his self-esteem, and I definitely affected the trajectory of his life and how he thought about himself. I got out of the session. Usually the shaman or the teacher suggests you take 48 hours before you call anyone or write any deep letter.
Mhm.
So I took that time, and then I found him on Facebook, and I wrote him a really beautiful, in my opinion, and long letter, just letting him know I had just done this healing journey and it had taken me back to elementary school, and it had shown me just how awful I was to him, and that I was just so sorry the way I treated him as a kid, and that, he never had to write me back or respond in any which way, but I wanted him to know that I'm heartbroken with the way that I treated him, and that I am so sorry. And if there's ever any way that, we could be a friend, or I could make it up to you, I would love to. I put a lot of time in writing him that message, because that's part of the post integration of these journey works, and part of my healing was writing that, and it was so healing for me to write that. And you know what? He's never responded, and I don't even know that he's read it. I just pray that he has, and that it warmed his heart, and that he was able to lessen his load a little bit and not carry so much of the weight. But that's what these plant medicines will show you. Like, it'll also show you the effects you have on other people, little subtle things that you maybe never think about. But I remember one time in a peyote session that afterwards, the mantra I kept hearing was helping, not hurting, helping, not hurting. And that's all life comes down to, is we need to be helping more than we're hurting, right? And we spend so much time not thinking about anyone but ourselves, or how somebody's going to react to the way we talk to them or the way we treat them. And that's what these mushrooms and this ayahuasca have given me, is they've given me empathy. They've opened my heart up. They've reconnected me back to people. And I know in my heart's heart he read that, and I know in my heart's heart that it meant a lot to him. And I hope one day I run into him, and I can see him face to face. But the step of writing him the letter, and then the step of going through the process, was super healing for me. I can only imagine that the ripples got out to him as well.
Yeah, were you able to, through the process of writing the letter, and truly through the process of feeling his pain, and coming out of that, were you able to find any forgiveness for yourself for having done that as well? I know that's a tough step for people to take, especially, when we go back and we see times when other people have harmed us and traumatized us. Um, I come out of those experiences feeling like, it's okay. Like I forgive that person for doing what they did. Like they didn't know any better. Um, but oftentimes when I come back from these experiences and I've experienced the harm that I've done to others, it's much more difficult for me to, I have found the forgiveness for myself, but it's much more difficult of a road to be able to do that. Were you able to find forgiveness for yourself for having done that in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. For me with ayahuasca, when I've been taken to these major traumas in my life, there's a lot of crying.
Mm,
There are a lot of tears being shed, and there's a release that's happening. And when I was crying through these moments with this individual, sure, I was forgiving myself too. And to be adult enough to write him a letter was a big step. But yeah, it does me no good to continue to be mad at myself for what I did as an unsuspecting little kid that was just trying to be cool or whatever. But I think what's very adult and very compassionate is that I took the time to find him and write him this message, and let him know how awful that was, and how sorry, as a 40-year-old man and who has young children, I am that I ever caused him a bad day. You know what I mean? Um, so yeah, I have definitely forgiven myself on that end. And when you have a lot of these large dose journeys and some of this ego dissolution, and you're taken back to this traumatic times, you also gain a real deep appreciation for special people in your life, mom and dad, brothers, siblings. And so I've also shared heartfelt messages with my mom and dad, and my brothers, and my friends. If anything, these plant medicines have made me more empathetic, and they've made me more vocal to just telling people that I love them, and how much they mean to me, and how important they were to me in my childhood. And I think that, in addiction, and with a lot of people I work with that are suffering from depression, they lack community, and they lack this feeling like they belong somewhere. And that's what I really like to create with my microdosing clients and the community, is just this feeling that, you're loved. You may come from a fucked up family. You may be divorced. Maybe somebody left you. Maybe you've done some bad shit. It doesn't matter what you've done. You're loved. And we can do the work to heal your trauma, and you can come on the other end better for it. And each one teach one, hopefully be able to help somebody else. So, yeah, I feel people need a community, and these plant medicines really kind of help to connect us.
Yeah, everyone needs a community. You were talking about, how everyone deserves that love, and I can remember, in my current practice, I work with, veterans and athletes and spiritual seekers, and I do psychedelic integration and general psychotherapy and addictions work and all these things. But coming up, I had to pay my dues in the mental health world, and I worked in a number of treatment centers for youth. I worked in the jail system as a therapist, and in particular, it reminded me of this period of a few years when I worked at a treatment center for youth sex offenders, and these were youth who had sexually offended on animals and infants and siblings and things like that. And um, I would talk to my fellow mental health professionals who were not working there and telling them what I was doing, and I was amazed by how many of them would just say, like, how could you work with those people? How could you provide help and benefit to someone who molested an infant or something like that, like an innocent being? And I was lucky enough to have been exposed to Buddhist concepts before that, and Buddhist Buddhist concepts and shamanism in my undergrad. And so my perspective going into that work was just like you said, like, no matter what you've done, no matter, if you're a mass murderer, or if you are Donald Trump, or if you are anybody, you know everybody deserves a community. Everybody deserves love. Everybody deserves healing from whatever it is that they're afflicted with. Most people who hurt people have been hurt themselves. And most of that behavior that they portray out there that is damaging to others stems from being damaged themselves. And I think most people just overlook that fact, or they don't dig deeper. They don't dig past the behaviors. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people are judging people, in a general sense, based off of some bad behavior, and I still have to go back and think that, everybody at their core is still a good person, is still a compassionate person. If they were given all the love and the nurturing that everybody else who's doing well, or, other people have gotten, then they too might not have made those behaviors or those decisions or those choices, right? So everybody deserves that love and compassion. I was just reminded of that when you said that.
Yeah, and I want to say that your juvenile sex offenders, no child grows up as a sex offender.
Mm-mm.
I would bet 99% of those juveniles were molested as children, and they were taught that this is how you show affection, or this is what you do to feel good, or this is how you do it. So your friends didn't understand that all those juvenile sex offenders used to be that infant that they're touching, and that they need this next level of compassion to understand why they're doing what they're doing. It's all they know. It's how they were raised. It's how they were imprinted. So there definitely needs to be this next level of compassion for everybody. And unfortunately, Western medicine isn't giving people very good options for healing. Talk therapy doesn't really work, especially with these deep traumas. And I think what it really comes down to is we're all just wounded children having wounded children, right? We go off and we have fun having sex, and we meet a girl, and oops, we're pregnant, and there's kids, but we haven't taken the time before we got in relationship with that woman to fall in love with ourselves, to heal our trauma. So we're two wounded people having a child, and then this child comes into this world wounded already, so it's everyone has the ability to heal. Everybody deserves that chance.
Mhm.
And you know A lot of people I work with are the people that have tried every pharmaceutical you could name, every antidepressant on the list, and they're coming to me with a last ditch effort, like, with no hope. And all of a sudden they're finding hope from a small amount of a mushroom that grows everywhere. There are wood chips or dirt. So it's fascinating. It's not necessarily for everybody, but I think across the board, we need something else to help people with addiction and trauma and anxiety. And I think, what you're doing with ketamine is a great, safe, and effective way to kind of get this started.
Yeah. Thank you. And, I just want to sort of cap off that that explanation of working in that youth center. You know, almost 100% of those kids were, like you said, uh, perpetrated on, as children. And I think one of my favorite outcomes that I saw from my work there, and it actually happened years later, was that one of these kids actually did heal quite a bit of their trauma, changed their life around, and then got into the counseling profession to specifically work with others just like himself who were youth offenders, because he knew from that perspective. Um, exactly what we're talking about, that he got his second chance and he was able to heal, and now he wanted to go back and pass that on. So I just wanted to kind of cap that experience off with on a positive note. You did mention earlier that I think you said your first ever um, experience with psilocybin was through a honey that was infused with the psychedelic. And I think this is interesting because we had earlier talked about sort of the synergistic effects that certain plant medicines have with each other, specifically cannabis and psilocybin, and how they can work really well to improve the effectiveness of each, if they're used in that way. Um, I know that the human body has cannabinoid receptors in our body to specifically pick up on cannabis. Um, I'm not sure if we have, or if there is such a thing of psilocybin-based receptors, although I know they sort of map on to other receptor sites, but I've never really spoken or heard them spoken of as we do with cannabinoid receptors. But what's really fascinating to me is this synergy between psychedelics and honey specifically. Um, so I think it was a Vice episode that I saw, where I saw this guy, go to Nepal and Tibet and was eating psychedelic honey gathered off of the cliffs that the Tibetan people had been using for many, many generations, for healing. And I ordered some and got some in, and it was profound. It was amazing what this honey contained in it. And I've heard, in Egypt, they would store mushrooms and in honey and bury them with various leaders. And Kalindi would talk about it, how psilocybin would be stored in honey, and the honey would turn blue because of the psilocin in there. And that honey is actually one of the best ways to store mushrooms because it has a shelf life of, I don't even know, like 1,000 years or something like that. And then you can just take it right off the shelf, and the psilocybin and the psilocin in there are still just as potent as when they were put in there, versus just storing it in oxygen environment, and it degrades over time, its potency. So this synergy between psychedelics and honey is fascinating to me, and I'm wondering if you've looked into that at all, and what has been your experience beyond that first experience between those two? Because honey's a medicine too. Between those two medicines, honey and psilocybin.
Yeah, honey is absolutely a medicine, and it's been mixed with psilocybin for as long as we know. And one of the oldest cave drawings we've ever found is in Spain, and it's this huge shaman mushroom man that has a bee head, and it's a human body, and his head is that of a bee, and then his entire body is lined with mushrooms. And it was basically a reference even 5,000 years ago to the fact that honey and mushrooms were combined, and that was the shaman would wear a bee head, or maybe it was just a representation or a teaching to later generations that the bee and the honey was very important combined with the psilocybin. But, I know that some people have trouble um, munching down
Hmm.
raw mushrooms. I know it's very hard for me. Honey is a sweet nectar. It's a really great way to be able to take mushrooms without having to taste it. I also feel like something magical happens with the honey where it kind of gets rid of the nausea, or maybe some of kind of the uncomfortable feelings that you might feel when you're taking it. But, I'm not sure how Kalindi would take 40 grams. But now when I think about honey, if I was going to eat 40 grams, I mean, it would either be 40 capsules or it would be, a bunch of honey. Would also be a great way to take a large dose. Um, but, honey, like you said, in the Egyptian society, they were using honey with mushrooms. It's just a way that you can safely store your mushrooms for long term. And it's also a safe and effective way to travel with it. I know a lot of people that prior to COVID loved to travel internationally with their mushroom honeys. And, they had no worry at the borders or customs of, anyone worrying what was in the mushroom. It was simply honey. So honey has just been a sacred, sacred way to carry the medicine, probably since time immemorial.
Yeah, and Paul Stamets talks about how sacred the bees are, in his movie, um, and it brings me back to this Nepalese Tibetan honey too that I tried, and I believe it is the rhododendron flower that the bees grab the pollen off of, and then they somehow metabolize it in a way that turns it psychedelic, and put it in the honey, and then the people eat it or they consume it. Um, it's just fascinating, very interesting stuff. So there's another thing you said too that I wanted to touch on, and I promise we'll get to flow and athletics because I just want to save a large chunk for that because that's going to be a good conversation. But there's this piece you said, when you were first starting up your business venture with mushrooms, that the medicine itself, the mushroom itself, sort of reconfigured, this is my own interpretation, kind of reconfigured the universe to start bringing people into your life and for you to make these connections. And it's my belief that the universe is sort of intricately linked with our minds and with consciousness in a way that mirrors what we put out. So if we're putting out like negative intentions, we get negative things back. If we're putting out positive intentions, we get positive things back. That's why like gift giving and charity can be so powerful, right? Because we get back tenfold what we put out there. Um, and the universe is always sort of on a metaphysical level, reconfiguring our reality subjectively for each one of us in a way that it presents to us opportunities to grow, to learn, to take advantage of opportunities, to fulfill our dreams, things like that. But oftentimes we're just so consumed with the day to day, or we're blinded by our egos and what we think is important with money and things like that, that we don't pay attention to what the universe is giving us or what the universe is presenting us. And it's almost like when you interact with this wisdom plant, when you interact with the mushroom, it's not that the universe is necessarily providing more opportunity to you. It seems more like we're just more tuned in to the signs and the signals that it's already giving us so that we can actually take advantage of those things that it's giving us, right? So in this way, it sounded like when you started engaging with the mushroom, these people started seeking you out and asking you questions, and you started making these connections, and everything just started falling into place without much effort. Would you say that that's sort of accurate, or how it happened, or?
I'd say that's completely accurate, with zero effort. And, not to get too hippy dippy here, but this was all intelligence that was told to me.
Mm,
They would say, you just do your work, we'll take care of the rest. And I remember seeing a quote by Terence McKenna, that somewhere along the lines of something like, the mushroom said to me, don't worry about how it gets done, we'll take care of it, or we'll remove all the obstacles. And they said a similar thing to me. They said, stop worrying about how the hard shit's going to happen. We'll take care of it. You just work on you. You just work on being a better person, being a happier person. And, they gave me downloads and they gave me little post-it notes of things to work on. Like one of the first things was find your joy. And I was like, find my joy. I'm 39 years old. I'm divorced. I'm a failure. I don't know how to, I don't know what joy is. And they laughed at me. The fucking mushrooms laughed at me and they're like, you know what joy is. What did you do when you were a kid? And in that moment, I flashed back to when I was a kid. I rode bikes. I played soccer. I played tennis. I went hiking. I climbed trees. I ran around and the mushrooms were like, do that. Do more of that. Find more joy. Be more childlike. Be more of a child. And I did do that. And the more I became more childlike, the more fun I had. It's like a magnet. The more people that were drawn to me, from the performance enhancement aspect, I'd have people seeing the change in me physically in the gym, or not being able to keep up with me on the trail run, or not having the endurance on the soccer field that they had with me the week before. And they would say, what gives? And to some extent, there is a next level of performance that cannabis or even microdosing psilocybin can give an athlete if they find that sweet spot. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And one of the connections that was brought your way is Dr. Jim Fatiman, correct?
Correct. Yeah, that's such a beautiful story. And I guess what I would call it law of attraction. You talked
Yeah.
earlier about, what you put out to the world comes back. The mushrooms helped me realize that, every thought I had created my world outside of me. So it really lent me to start thinking in the way of dreams. Like if I could dream anything, like instead of practicing nightmaring, I practice daydreaming. Okay. Most of the United States, they nightmare all day. It's always worst case scenario, nightmare, 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 nightmare. What you got to really learn to do is daydream more, be creative, be imaginative, be inspirational, create stuff. So I spent more time daydreaming. And then one of these large dose journeys, I was asking for the guidance, and the mushroom said, contact Dr. Fatiman, find out who is the world's leading expert on microdosing, find him, go see him, tell him what you're doing, and we'll take care of the rest. And I got out of the journey and I went to the internet and I looked on his webpage, and he had just announced a speaking date in Salt Lake City in a week. I happened to go to college in Salt Lake City, had friends there. I flew in, and he stepped off the stage this first night after his talk, and I stepped right in front of him like Sirhan or some kind of assassin, basically mugged the guy, and shared with him what I was doing. And he lives about 2.5 hours away from me here in California. And when we got back to California, we started talking. I spent some time visiting him, sharing with him some of these patient reports and some of this amazing data we had. And from there, we've just become fast friends. He's become an amazing mentor to myself, and to a lot of people that I work with. And he's just an amazing individual, somebody that's been around since the original Harvard psilocybin experiment. He was part of that in 1962 with Ram Dass and Tim Leary. He took his first dose of psilocybin, I think, in 61 in a cafe in Paris, where Ram Dass was coming through on his first trip to India, and gave Jim a hit of synthetic psilocybin in a coffee house. But he's also the founder of transpersonal psychology, with, I believe it's Groff, and also the author of the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, which came out about 13 years ago, and is an amazing book for any psychedelic explorers out there. And in that book, it was the first time in modern history that somebody talked about microdosing. And after Dr. Fatiman wrote that book, for the next 13 years up into the present, he's receiving emails every day from people around the world sharing with them how microdosing has changed their life. So, more than anything, we're just sharing data, sharing patient stories, and really right now trying to go out there and re-educate the world on the proper education behind psychedelics. In the same way with cannabis, we had to re-educate everybody. We have to re-educate everybody with psychedelics. What Nixon taught everybody and what the war on drugs did isn't really the truth. So the most important thing is right now, when working with Dr. Fatiman, just getting out as much as possible and educating people on what is microdosing, how to safely and effectively microdosing, what to look for, what not to look for, what to use, and just kind of making it more accessible to people so that when they do microdose, they have more successful outcomes.
Nice. I have two quick stories to share with you too, and that's an awesome story about how you met Jim. Um, so the first story is related to how you said you had this dream, right? This premonition that you should go do this, or the dream spoke to you. Um, I had a dream, maybe it was 6 weeks ago or so, just out of the blue, out of nowhere, and Dr. Stan Groff shows up in my dream, and I'd never dreamt about him before. I'd met him a few times at the psychedelic conference. I took a holotropic breathwork workshop with him and met he and his wife, and they taught us their technique. Um, but he entered my dream, and in my dream, long story short, I somehow figured out in the middle of the dream that Stan Groff had dosed me in my own house, and my house became like this fun house. Moving through different rooms, things like that. And then at the end of the dream, he sort of puts us all in this room and has us write down. He says, write down 3 words to describe your experience. And I couldn't remember my words, but it seemed like Stan Groff had dosed me in my own house and then turned it into a research experiment on me and a bunch of other people that were in the house. It was really interesting. And I took this dream to my Jungian psychologist who I work with. And he's telling me, he's like decoding the symbolism in the dream. And he tells me, he's like, who's this Stan Groff to you? And I'm like, well, he's like a psychedelic god in my eyes. He's more experienced than almost anybody at psychedelic therapy. And he's like, and I said, but I've been trying to reach out to get him on the podcast. And, he said he had a stroke last November. And so he hasn't been doing many public appearances. And so I get it. That's why he's not responding. And my therapist told me, he's like, Stan showed up in your dream to give you his blessing to continue to do this work and to carry on the work that he's done for so long. That was his purpose in this dream, was to show you that. And I just started like bawling in therapy. I'm like, oh my God, this is exactly what I wanted to hear from him himself. And he said, even if he never reaches back out to you, just know that on a psychic, cosmic, spiritual level, because I believe that those dreams do have that sort of that impact and that meaning, that Stan Groff gave you his blessing to do this work. And I just felt so honored in that moment. So that was my first dream story. It was really cool to kind of reaffirm the work that I'm doing in this space. The second story I want to share with you is actually how I met Jim Fatiman. And it was one of the coolest moments of my life, because he too was like one of my heroes. I had him on my podcast last year, I think. But I first met him at the 2017 MAPS conference in Oakland. And I had been trying to track him down all weekend, trying to figure out like where's he going to give his talks? How can I meet him? And every time he'd give a talk, he always like had to dip off the stage and not like meet with anybody, right? So I never got a chance to meet him. And then one night near the end of the conference, I'm just sort of wandering around the hallways, and I look up off my phone, and Jim Fatiman's standing like right in front of me. And I'm like, holy shit, you're Jim Fatiman. And he and I get to talking, and it's just me and him in this hallway. And he's so friendly and so open to talking, especially if you want to talk about microdosing. And so I start to talk to him about microdosing. He's talking to me about all his work, and I already know what he's done, but he's talking to me about some of the new things he's interested in. And I bring up the topic of microdosing for performance enhancement, and his eyes just lit up. And he said, there's so many people out there who are studying psychedelics for the healing potentials, and that's much needed. We need these medicines for a lot of the healing that we need individually, collectively, in couples, in all sorts of things, community traumas, all sorts of things. But he said, there's not very many people maybe only a handful who are talking about the entire other side of psychedelics on how we can better the well, and how we can use these modern technologies to enhance human potentials beyond what we are currently able to achieve. And so I'm talking to him about how I use, microdosing psilocybin or LSD for my jiu-jitsu tournaments, and how I'm noticing things like better balance, more access to my strength potentials, time dilation to where, my opponent is moving much slower and I'm able to predict what their movement's going to be almost telepathically before they know what they're going to do, how my eye-hand coordination is much better, my breathing is much better, cardiovascular better, all these things are better. And he just like, he was really drawn into what I had to share with him. And so we had a good talk. He gives me his card, and I was just like, "Oh my god, that was one of the best conversations I will probably ever have in my life." Um, and so I left it at that. And the next night, he was giving his keynote speech at that conference, and I went and I attended. And I'm sitting, like, the room is packed. Every chair is full. I can't get a seat, so I'm sitting like in front of the chairs on the floor, like right in front of the podium, or actually off to the side of the podium. And he's giving his keynote speech, and it's well prepared. And then, right in the middle of his keynote speech, he sort of stops talking from his note card or whatever. And he looks up and he says, I just had an amazing conversation with this young man out in the hallway yesterday about him using microdosing and jujitsu to do these amazing things. And he just like totally lets his speech go and starts talking about this conversation that he and I had. And I'm sitting there in the front row, like my heart is racing. I'm like, oh my God, Jim Fatiman is talking about me in front of all these people. It was so amazing. And, later on, a couple years down the road, I'm reaching out to him to try and get him on the podcast and trying to remind him of who I am and that we had met. And on the podcast, he brings up that story again. And he says, I met this guy at the conference, and he's telling me about jujitsu and microdosing, and it's amazing. And you do jujitsu. And I'm like, that was me. That was me that you were talking to in the hallway. He just meets so many people who are interested in this topic.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's my story of meeting Jim Fatiman, and that opens the door for us to start talking about psychedelic potentialities in human beings, athletics, exercise, and flow states, and how all these things are interconnected. And we think as human beings that we are functioning at our highest levels possible right now, but anyone who has done a microdose and gone and done the things that they do already will already know that their potential is far greater than what they currently think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when I first met Jim, some of the stuff that or interested him the most was the work that I was doing with a few NHL athletes. And there are a few really great former pro football and hockey players who've been great advocates for cannabis. One is Riley Cote of the Flyers, and Eben Britton, who was a football player in the NFL. And through Riley, he connected me with some still current professional NHL hockey players who wanted to use microdosing as a performance enhancer. And so I began to work with a few of these players, and they saw immediate results. Like with day one, they saw themselves faster on the ice. They saw more oxygen intake, more stamina. Much like you said with jiu-jitsu, they were seeing the pass before it left the stick. There was no more worrying about what's for dinner or what my girlfriend's up to. It's simply pure flow state in the moment. And I think that that's the next level that these microdosing of, in my opinion, psilocybin gives people. In the same way that in 1970, Doc Watson took a hit of LSD and went out and threw a no-hitter for the Oakland A's. You can even scale back that large dose into these smaller subthreshold doses and still get a next level of performance. The way Dr. Fatiman also mentions it is he'll get a lot of reports from people in the gym that says, I do, 2 extra sets the days that I microdose, or I've been able to shave a few minutes off of my mile time, or a few minutes off of my, half mile time. seconds, not minutes, whatever. But basically, he's definitely seeing the same reports that I'm seeing from these hockey players, that there's a next level. There's almost another gear that people are given. Now, this is a different gear than Balco or steroids or human growth hormone, where it's messing with your whole body and your personality. I mean, I'd have these hockey athletes, these NHL players, after 2 or 3 weeks of microdosing, their wives start microdosing, or they want to know if their sister or somebody else can try it. So people were seeing benefits in these athletes, beyond the ice. They were seeing it in their home life. So there is a next level of performance that, I've seen in the soccer field myself, in the gym, in trail running. I have one friend who does marathons and 50-mile races. He did his last 50-mile microdosing and also saw a next level, another gear, was able to shave a whole bunch of minutes off of. So I've also worked with Navy SEALs. I've worked with active duty and retired Navy SEALs who are looking for that next level in their life and their workout. And, the interesting thing with mushrooms is, I don't know that you can order a drug kit that tests for psilocybin. They're not testing for psilocybin in the NHL or the NFL or Major League Baseball or at the hospital if you're a doctor or a lawyer. They're just not part of a normal drug screen. So again, this is kind of a performance enhancing tool right now that athletes are just starting to kind of get wind of, that can really give them a next level of performance.
Yeah, and like you said, it is a performance enhancer, but it shouldn't be in the same class as those other performance enhancing drugs like steroids and things like that. Because up to this point, all those other performance enhancing drugs that are screened for have like very serious negative side effects, there's, the list is so long I can't even begin to start naming it, but there are, I don't know if there's any negative side effects reported from microdosing mushrooms or microdosing LSD. None.
The really fascinating thing to interrupt you with is, not only are there no reports, you can microdose with just about any other prescription medication on the planet.
Mhm.
According to the 13 years of data that Dr. Fatiman's collected, the only pharmaceutical medication that has a side effect with microdosing is lithium. Other than that, the only other issue for people is if they have some rare form of color blindness. If they have some rare form of color blindness and they microdose, they have prolonged tracers for 2 to 3 days, right? Not pleasant, not something you want. Other than that, you can still microdose with antidepressants, with Adderall, with anxiety medications, with all these things, because these mushrooms, psilocybin, are non toxic, non habit forming. There's absolutely nothing like that on the planet. And the really cool thing about microdosing psilocybin is it has a 48-hour effect, which means you take your dose on a Monday, you don't take your dose on Tuesday, and you're still benefiting and you're still feeling that optimism and that energy and everything that you would feel in a dose day. I mean, that's another thing that's unheard of, is that you're still getting benefits 2 days after you've taken the substance. And we know from medical trials that, these psilocybin mushrooms can be out of your system within 6 to 12 hours. So again, super non-toxic, super habit forming. For these athletes that I'm working with in the NHL, they're not taking it 7 days a week. We're coming up with a protocol where there's 1 day on, sometimes 2 days off. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. But again, they haven't found an amount of mushrooms you could eat that would kill you or an animal. Same with cannabis. There are these really amazing plant medicine gifts that have been given to us, and they've tried to like feed it to animals until they die, or inject animals till they die, and they don't. So it's non-toxic, non-habit forming, they're non-lethal. And just to bring it back briefly to Dr. Fatiman, what makes him so special to me, next to people like Ram Dass and Groff, is that he's the only one that concentrated on small doses. Okay. Every single other person was all about blast off, large doses, ego destruction. And you know what? The funny thing about Jim is he was like that too, until he wrote Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. And then when he got to get all the research in from people, thousands of people around the world who have been using these small doses to change their life, almost sometimes more effectively than these large doses, he realized he really had something, and he dedicated his life to kind of researching these small doses. So I think that that's really important to mention is that I'm so excited about what small doses of psychedelics can do for people. We know what the large doses can do for them. They're very healing. I suggest those in the right set and settings with guides. But I think what's really going to help people in the day-to-day is the ability to one day get microdosing prescribed by a doctor, however it's going to work, but to be able to safely and effectively microdose throughout the week to, increase your mood and increase your life.
Yeah, so just to clarify a little bit, you said you can microdose with nearly any pharmaceutical drug out there. And at first, when you said that, I thought you were talking about like if you were on an antidepressant, like literally only microdosing the antidepressant at a smaller level. But
No, sorry.
yeah, what you meant was microdosing the psilocybin and still being on your medication and having almost no cross.
Yeah, let me clear that up. As a coach, an educator, I work with a lot of people that are on medications.
Mhm.
The most popular medications are antidepressants, right? The majority of our population is overprescribed on anti-medications, Adderalls, anti-anxieties, you name it. So for a lot of people, their major concern is what's going to happen if I take Adderall and I microdose? Well, the good news is nothing. The microdosing over time will make you need less Adderall and will actually completely replace the Adderall. It's the same with people who have pharmaceutical medications. A lot of them have certain conditions. Maybe they're taking a certain kind of medication and they think that they can't combine it with the microdosing. I am not a doctor. I have not done clinical trials, but what Dr. Fatiman has seen, and again, he has not done clinical trials either, is from more than a decade of reports, is that people are really seeing benefits from this.
Yeah, for sure. And so, for those out there who might not be familiar with Jim Fatiman or the Fatimid Protocol or other microdosing protocols, you did mention the protocol that's most likened with Fatiman, with the 1 day on, 2 days off before your next dose. Sort of the theory behind that being that you're still feeling the effects a little bit the second day. You give yourself a third day to like reset the brain chemistry a little bit, and then on the fourth day redose back up to that microdose level. That way you also don't build tolerance to the medicine too. I've heard other protocols put out there as well. Folks that prefer to microdose every single day, not really caring that much about the performance enhancing effects, because those do tend to, I think, uh, wane a little bit if you do take them every single day. But they're viewing it more as like almost like a nutritional supplement that they want to take every day. Like if someone was supplementing with lion's mane mushroom every single day, they want to also supplement with psilocybin every single day. In that sense, like it's doing something with the brain, connecting things every day. So for you and the way that you coach people, what sort of protocols and what sort of dosages and what sort of run me through, like as if I was a client coming to you, what would you suggest?
That's a great question. So the first thing I'd say is that there's no one protocol that works for everyone, and there's no one dosage that works for everyone. And that's what's so great about having a coach or an educator, somebody that can walk somebody through this that's never done it before. So right now there's three major protocols that are out there. The first one and the original one is the Fatimid protocol. That's the one you just talked about. I've talked to Jim at length about why he came up with this report, and basically what he's saying, or this protocol, sorry, is that you take it on your dose day. The second day, you're not taking it, but you're in afterglow. You're still getting the benefits from it. You're in that 48-hour window where you're still feeling great like you did on day one. And then day three is to be sober. It's a day to just, like you said, get yourself back to normal, equilibrium, journal. And then again, the following day is your next dose day. Now, the other most popular protocol is the Stamets protocol by Paul Stamets. And he says you can be flexible, whether it's 4 days on and 3 days off, or 5 days on and 2 days off. But Paul Stamets believes that microdosing is going to become like a nootropic vitamin one day, and that everybody's just going to be taking it like vitamin C. And so with that in mind, I think he's probably, and I've never heard him really spoke in depth about it, but the idea is probably 4 days of building it up in your system, and then you're going to benefit from that afterglow on the other days. The other real important protocol is by the Microdosing Institute. They're a group out of Holland that's worked with Dr. Fatiman for the last 5 years. And their protocol is day on and day off. And I would say that that day on, day off is probably the protocol that could work most well for everybody out there, probably the one that across the board I think would do best. The reason I say that is the Fatiman protocol, if somebody's dealing with depression or we're weaning off of antidepressants, or we need to be taking the microdose more in the first few weeks, those 2 days off doesn't really work for the patient. They need to be dosing more in that first month. So that's when I might suggest a Microdosing Institute protocol. I rarely use the Stamets protocol. More than anything, we come up with individual protocols for the person. What we do is we start with day one and week one, and we make sure that we find that sweet spot and that that person has that right dose where it's subperceptual. Once we find that right dose, then we look into the protocol and we figure out where in the week they should take their days off. I might have some people do 2 days on, 1 day off. Some people might be 1 day on, 2 days off. More than anything, it's totally individualized to the person, what they need, what other medications they're trying to get off or they're weaning off of. So again, there's no one size fits all, but what's really great about microdosing is after you've done it for a month, and I highly suggest that you do it for a month before you give up. You have to do it for a prolonged period of time. But after you do it for a month, you become more intuitive and you kind of come up with your own protocol and your own schedule. And what I've found after more than 2 years of microdosing is I start to feel so good during the week that I forget to microdose. And that's kind of the really cool thing about this is the more you do it, the less you need it. And it's the exact opposite of an antidepressant. So there's not one protocol that fits for everyone. The three main protocols are the Fatiman protocol, which is 1 day on, 2 days off, the Stamets protocol, which is 4 days on, 3 off, and then the Microdosing Institute protocol, which is day on, day off. Again, for me, we just kind of set up intuitively with the intention, maybe the other pharmaceuticals they're on, and we figure out a protocol individually for each person because everybody's a little different.
So then how about for this is individualistic too, and I think it's important for each person to find that subperceptual dose. And for those out there who don't know what that means, finding a dose where your perception is not altered. So you're not seeing tracers, you're not tripping. So this needs to be individualistic too, based on different metabolisms and body weight and things like that. What is an average dose for most people? Where do you suggest people start at for a microdose?
Yeah, great question. So again, when I'm working with clients, I'm working strictly with psilocybin. So anytime that I'm talking about a percentage or a dose, it's going to be psilocybin. So microdosing psilocybin is a microdose anywhere from 0.1 to 0.4. 0.1 is 100 milligrams, 0.4 is 400 milligrams. Another way to look at that would be 400 milligrams would be 40% of 1 gram. Okay. 0.4 is on the high end of a microdose. 0.4 for myself and a lot of people will make you feel like you're tripping. It will put you on that threshold of wondering if you're going to blast off. So a great way to do this, and I highly suggest remembering this saying, is start low and go slow. And what you would do is you would start at the bottom with 0.1, and you would start with 0.1 or 100 milligrams of psilocybin. You would take your dose with food in your morning and you would go about your day. If you feel high or you're noticing the substance too much, then we might need to dial it back to 50 milligrams and 0.05 or something like that. For most people, for a grown man my size or your size, I'd say the sweet spot's usually around 0.15 or 0.165, somewhere between 0.15 and 0.2. I really kind of recommend staying between 0.1 and 0.2. I have a lot of people who have a tough time understanding what it means to truly microdose. People contact me after 2 or 3 days and they're like, I don't feel anything. Shouldn't I feel something? And I was like, well, read me your journal. And all of a sudden they read me their journal and their day's been awesome and they're accomplishing all these things. And then they're like, oh, it's these little subtle changes. It's not like the carpet's moving, or, so again, once you find that sweet spot, it's a really special place for somebody. And I think some people are really sensitive. Some women I've worked with are really sensitive, and that 0.15 is going to be too much for them. So again, it's about finding that sweet spot. And the best way to do that is start low and go slow. Start with 0.05 if you're really worried, or zero point 0.1. And if you don't notice it, great, you found your sweet spot. And give it time. Microdosing isn't like macrodosing. It's not this, you take a pill and 8 hours later, you know what you need to work on the next few months. Microdosing is little by little, subtle steps, brick by brick. But what you're going to find every day is your mood's increased. You have more energy. You're more positive conversations with your mind, less negative thinking. Your child spills the milk on the table and you're reacting to it completely different. And I think that that's the beauty of psilocybin, is it gives people empathy, and you're more empathetic, you're more understanding, you're more relaxed, and you're just not taking everything seriously. And, in today's society, 2020 pandemic, everything we're dealing with, we need a new form of antidepressant. We need some kind of nootropic psychedelic vitamin that helps us. And we've got one. It's non-toxic, it's non-habit forming. And we just need to continue to re-educate so we can reschedule and make this available to the masses soon enough.
Nice. And you said you like to stack it with lion's mane. Do you stack it with other mushrooms as well? I know there's got to be thousands of different species.
Yeah, there's so many incredible mushrooms, and you really could stack it with unlimited mushrooms. We have a proprietary blend of functional mushrooms stacked with the psilocybin that we're going to launch in Holland in January. And the mushrooms that I'm most excited about are lion's mane, and cordyceps, and chaga. I highly recommend getting all three of those mushrooms into your daily diet. Cordyceps specifically for athletes is a big one. Science has shown that eating cordyceps mushrooms increases your VO2 intake. It also gives you sustained energy throughout the day. And they've done a whole bunch of tests and studies with athletes in cordyceps, and it totally gives them a next level of endurance. There's a great story from the 1980s Chinese Olympic team. The women's long distance team shaved the world record by like 10 minutes, and everybody accused them of steroids. And it turns out they were taking 4 grams of cordyceps mushrooms every day. So for all the athletes out there, or for people that are looking for sustained energy, that next gear, that stacking of cordyceps, psilocybin, lion's mane, and chaga is really next level.
Nice. Do you have any so I have a background in sports psychology. The whole reason why I got into the idea that we could use psychedelics for performance enhancing is because of my previous experience with my first ever drug experience, the LSD, being blown open to the idea of consciousness. And then my passion for athletics. I've always been an athlete my whole life. I've been a martial artist for 32 years now. And then also, the natural ability to reach these flow states was really what drew me into sports psychology. And then, luckily I found a way to sort of marry them all together. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your experience with flow states. If you have any stories to share about flow states and microdoses, anything in particular that stands out to you as just being, I don't know, something amazing.
Yeah. So flow states, I'm a big fan of flow states. What I think is happening in the brain with microdosing and athletics and flow states is the psilocybin is blocking that default mode network. The lion's mane and psilocybin is creating new neural pathways, making you more creative, also making you more focused and in the moment, thus creating flow state. Some of my best stories come from probably 15, 16 years ago when I lived in Salt Lake City in Utah, and I spent a lot of time snowboarding and backcountry snowboarding, doing all kinds of intense, really extreme stuff. We used to mess around with psychedelics, specifically psilocybin. And there were a few times on a powder day where I found that sweet spot, which meant I was in perfect flow state, I was fearless, and I was untouchable. And I saw a next level of performance. Now, when you look at extreme sports like snowboarding, you're already in a flow state, because if you're going 70 miles an hour down the side of a mountain on one edge, you don't have time to think, or you're going to think and you're going to be dead. So basically, I was already in a flow state from the extreme snowboarding, but then using the psilocybin allowed me this next level of control in athletics. And so I've also seen that in soccer. I've seen that on the soccer field where I'll go out there and everything's slower for me. I've got a next level of gear. And I definitely have people coming up to me afterwards, like, what's up? You know, like, I know you smoke cannabis before you play, but are you on something else? What's the story? And there really is a next level of performance. You know, they've been giving microdoses to military people in our country and other countries to heighten their hearing, to increase their visual acuity. So we know that these things are amplifiers and they enhance our ability to focus and do things. So honestly, you know, one of my goals outside of Flow State Micro, the microdosing company in Europe, is I want to create a Flow State university or an academy where we train professional athletes how to use psychedelics as performance enhancing tools. Because I think most of these athletes need that. They need that next level of performance. They need to be able to give up their home life and the drama that's going on with their contract, or whether they're going to go down to the minors or stay up in the bigs. There's a lot of pressure that these athletes have on their plate that none of us take into account. And when I started working with a lot of these NHL players, the first thing we take a look at when we got microdosing was their diet and what was their pregame routine. And, you know, they were chewing tobacco and drinking Folgers coffee 30 minutes before they got on the ice. And so, you know, the microdosing lent to other changes in these athletes' lives, like better diets. You know, they're doing Wim Hof, they're doing cold water immersion. We're working on breath work and breath holds. So I really see a future in training professional athletes, specifically, call it a brain trainer, call it, you know, positive thinker, sports psychologist, whatever you want. But, you know, in the same way that the Astros were cheating by banging on a trash can to steal signs, sports are ruthless. They're going to do anything they can to get the next competitive advantage. And what I'm telling you is the next competitive advantage is microdosing psychedelics, specifically psilocybin and LSD. And I have, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if within the next 1 to 3 years, I'm flying around the world, meeting with professional football teams, soccer teams, baseball teams, and explaining to people how to use these things safely and effectively to increase their performance.
Well, if you ever start that Flow State University,
You're in.
sign me up for a
You're
job.
you're
I will.
hired.
You know, that's my dream. Has always been my dream to have a job where I can travel the world and do what I love, which is help people optimize their mind to work for themselves better, you know, in the ways that we know how. So, yeah, hire me up.
Well,
Yeah.
let's make that happen right now. You're hired,
Mhm.
because I need you and I need a good team, and we will make this happen. Right now, we're going to do a good job of educating. You know, these 4 hockey players tell their friends. It turns into 5, 6, 7. Next thing you know, it's a full team. Next thing you know, teams are fighting over the ability to get in contact with us. This is what it's about. You know, I've been able to enhance and change my life and those of many. For society, sometimes it's the athletes or it's the celebrities that bring a new medium into the masses. It was the same with cannabis. A lot of times it was the celebrities and it was the athletes that really helped us kick down the walls. Much like the children, like Charlotte Figge and the CBD movement, the children also move us. So I'm excited about this being a performance enhancing tool. And I'm excited for athletes, because the beauty is these athletes are over medicated. They're injured all the time. And the football players are shot up with Toradol before they take the field. So basically they could run through a wall and they don't feel anything. So it's not only what we can give these athletes for performance, but it's also off the ice. It's off the court. It's off the field. It's the ability for them to heal. It's the ability for them to become a more empathetic individual. It's the ability for them to not need narcotics and alcohol. You know, one of these great football players and cannabis advocates, Eben Britton, told me one of the first times we talked that after a game, an away game, you'd hop on the plane and the trainer would come around and hand you 2 Bud Lights and pour a bunch of pills in your hand. And you don't even know what the fucking pills are that they're getting you addicted to. And the next thing you know, the average football career is 3 years and you leave broke and addicted to opiates. And there's just a better way for these athletes, you know, much like veterans, or not much like veterans, but much like veterans, these athletes are forgotten once they're retired, or they're not productive on the field anymore. And a lot of them grow broke and have horrible lives. And so I think these athletes deserve these medicines off the field as much as they do on. And for CTE, for traumatic brain injury, one of my favorite clients is a semi-pro hockey player, who was a friend of this NHL player that was knocked unconscious in a fight, and he hit his head on the deck, and he was in a coma and had to learn to walk and talk again. He had to start over and learn everything again. And for many months, he was struggling with his speech, and he was really struggling with his confidence. And this is a hockey player that used to be, confidence was not this guy's issue, right? And he began to microdose, and his speech improved within 30 minutes. And within 2 or 3 days, I was getting calls from his friends like, I can't fucking believe this. This guy is doing incredible. And so I think some of the most promising stuff we have for athletes is what the psilocybin and lion's mane and cannabis can do to repair their brain. I mean, the lion's mane and the psilocybin specifically, I saw in this traumatic brain injury, it's given this guy his life back. He got his confidence back. He's not suffering from any of the issues he used to suffer from in the traumatic brain injury, except now and again, head pain. His migraines have been reduced significantly. So there's something really, really special with psilocybin and the brain. And this is really, really needed for athletes, for MMA, for jiu-jitsu, for boxers, for football players, for extreme sports athletes that have been slamming their brain over and over and over. There's nothing on the market that heals and regrows brain. And we know that lion's mane mushroom and psilocybin does that. So, that's what I'm so excited about in sports is not only could we be training, football teams on how to use this for performance enhancement, but we could be training them on how to use this for recovery and for giving them their brain and their life back, not only when they're on the field, but also when they retire.
Yeah, I have a client right now. He's in his late 70s and he's suffering from Alzheimer's and dementia, and had been on the downturn for the last few years, losing control over bodily functions and things like that. And he started a microdosing protocol with psilocybin, and he can take care of himself now. His wife is like, what did you do? Like, all the doctors thought that this was just going to be a downward turn from here on out, but just from the microdosing, that's all he changed. And his brain seems to be regrowing those connections that were lost because of these degenerative diseases. And I was just going to mention too, like, I did a study, or like a pilot study in my master's degree, on extreme sport athletes. And at the time I had some inroads into professional snowboarding, and they connected me with other professional extreme athletes. And these athletes were reporting that, and this was back in the early 2000s, that upwards of 90% of extreme athletes were already taking psychedelics on competition day, doing these things and not really having coaching and not knowing how to do them, but they knew that they were working. And so they were doing them, and they were noticing that everyone on the podium was using these psychedelics. And then, you hear just in the last, few episodes, Joe Rogan talking about how widespread it is in MMA now, that people, these fighters are microdosing psilocybin and finding that they can, fight so much better and have greater perceptual awareness and greater awareness of themselves and, their opponent and the space and all these things. Those are two areas that I think, you should definitely look into tapping into for sure, is the extreme sports and the combat sports. And combat sports, it seems to go like hand in hand. It's been with warriors in their culture for a long, long time. The Vikings would take mushrooms before going into battle and find it beneficial. Mongolians using it on the Siberian plains. All sorts of warrior cultures. You mentioned Aztecs and Mayans and things like that, actively and intentionally taking psychedelics before going into battle, knowing that it was going to help them do the thing that they needed to do. So, yeah, I think there's a bright future for all of this. And I wanted to share one last story with you about a microdosing experience that I had. my last pro jiu-jitsu match that I had um, was in Denver, and I was microdosing some LSD that day, and went out on the mats and did well, but I lost the match, unfortunately. The guy I went against had been at the belt level that we were competing at for a number of years ahead of me, and so had much greater experience than me. And I got off the mat, and we ended up connecting and becoming friends. I later had him on the podcast, and we were talking about that match. And it turned out that while I was microdosing on LSD that night, he was microdosing on psilocybin that night. And so it ended up not being a battle of the humans. It ended up being a battle of the molecules on the mat that night. And
Oh,
you're happy to hear that the psilocybin won out that night. Although, it was a good match, and I'd like a rematch one day. So,
you
um,
got to run it. You got to run it back and both take the same amount of psilocybin.
yeah, that'd be great. I'm sure he'd be down too. So, in the last few minutes that we have, and thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure getting to know you, and I hope that this is just the beginning of a long time friendship and working relationship together. Um, can you tell the audience a little bit more about Flow State Micro, specifically what you're hoping to do with it? And where people can go to check it out, and what you said you were going to roll some stuff out in Holland. Are there going to be any products available in the United States anytime soon, or how do people get a hold of you and what Flow State Micro is doing?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. So Flow State Micro is not only a supplement, it's also a community. We're looking to create a community of like-minded individuals who want to learn about microdosing and share with each other what's going on and the changes they're going through. Right now, we have a private Facebook group called Flow State Community. So I'd love everybody to check that out on Facebook, Flow State Community, and join us there. And you can see some before and after photos of some of my clients, and you can see just some really great firsthand testimonials of how this is helping people. Unfortunately, it's not legal for me to sell anything currently anywhere but Jamaica, Brazil, and Holland right now. So I can't legally sell, but what I tell people is nature provides. And then I help them safely and reliably figure out, once they acquire elsewhere their products, how to effectively and safely dose. I then set up an individual and unique protocol, and then I work with them as a pre and post integration coach. So people that are working with me in the United States might not be able to buy a supplement from me, but they can still work with me as a coach, and we can work you through your own program and set up something individualized for yourself. Over in Holland, it's legal for me to sell microdosing kits. So right now we're getting prepared to launch a kit in January that combines psilocybin truffles with lion's mane, chaga, and cordyceps, which are these other really important functional mushrooms that I think bring a lot of things to the table. And you can check me out on Facebook, Adam Bramlage. That's Bramlage. Instagram, it's hummingbird_medicinals. And I got a lot of great information on the Instagram page as far as John Hopkins and their research and all the latest data that come out on psilocybin. I'm about to teach a 6-week intensive course starting out in December, on December 13th, with the San Francisco Psychedelic Society, the Microdosing Institute, and Dr. James Fatiman. This is a fully intensive 6-week course where we're really going to dive in microdosing. We're going to build a community. We're going to have weekly live classes, weekly live discussions, and everyone's going to get a chance to ask the world's leading expert, Dr. Fatiman, any and every question they could possibly have about microdosing and their journey through microdosing. My website's flowstatemicro.com. Right now, it's just a simple landing page, but pretty soon, those people in the European Union will be able to order products off that webpage. In the meantime, I would say don't give up hope when it's not legal in North America. Nature provides, and there are definitely ways to safely access these substances. More importantly, it's about setting you guys up with safe, reliable protocols, dosages, and then the proper education and guidance, which is why a coach is important for people with no experience. For people like Shane, who have plenty of experience, they might not need a microdosing coach. They might not need, all of the protocol, all of the regimen. But for those that are stepping into it for the first time, it really helps to be with somebody who's experienced. One of the biggest mistakes I see are people are taking too large of a dose, and it's not an actual microdose. So it's really important to, again, go slow, start low, find your sweet spot. And then, anyone can reach out to me on Facebook or Instagram. I can help with individual client consults and just kind of go through your own personal process and intention and figure out if we can't help you get involved in this microdosing movement.
Nice. And nature does provide for sure. When I have clients come to me and they inevitably ask, well, can you get me some mushrooms or something? I'm like, no, 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 no. That's not what I do. But let me tell you, like, as soon as you put that intention again back out into the universe that, this is a medicine that I want to engage with, as soon as you put that out there, that medicine starts working on you, and it starts working its way towards you and into your life. And I tell people, if you don't have any sources for these medicines right now, don't be afraid to just go out there and start talking about them with other people. Start talking about your interest in them with friends and with family and with the guy on the side of the street at the bus stop that you meet. And inevitably, you are going to run into somebody who knows where to find them or how to find them, or knows a spot up in the mountains where to go pick them or whatever. They grow all over the place. I know a bunch of spots up here in Fort Collins, just in the city limits, where they grow. And interestingly enough, in most cities, right around courthouses, right in the bushes of courthouses, these things seem to grow. It seems like this wisdom is trying to tell us something and try and change the people going in and out of those buildings. But anyway,
and funny enough, you can legally order spores of
yeah,
psilocybin to every state in the United States except California and Georgia. So there are videos and there are ways out there for people to safely and effectively to grow their own mushrooms, which is a great opportunity. What I'll say to you is this, and we can kind of end it on that, is I at this point cannot legally sell psilocybin in the United States, but that is my ultimate goal with Flow State Micro. The reason that we're in Holland and that we then hope to go to Jamaica and Brazil is because those are the only three countries right now where psilocybin is legal. But my eventual hope and goal is to be the first, safest, and most reliable microdosing supplement available by prescription in the United States. Lucky for myself, I spent 12 years in the cannabis space. I brought two companies to licensure, made them profitable and sold them. So I've been through this dance. I'm pretty sure how it's going to go with psilocybin, and hopefully it goes a similar way as cannabis, where it starts with a prescription for a doctor, and then it eases up and is available to most everybody. But my ultimate goal is to be the first, if not the first, microdosing company and supplement within North America.
Nice. Yeah, I'm part of the Denver Psilocybin Policy Review Panel. So we're trying to make Denver right now a sanctuary city for these types of medicines. So we'll have you in. We'll have you talk to the panel. Have you talk to the district attorney and the city council members and all that stuff soon. But thanks again, Adam, for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure. And for all you listeners out there, thanks for listening. And we'll see you guys next time. Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.